Hello and welcome to this introduction to Gold Standard for the Global Goals. My name is Sarah Lugers. I'm the Director of Communications for Gold Standard. We'll start today with answering the question, why Gold Standard for the Global Goals? Then we'll talk about who's involved, who is Gold Standard partnering with to develop and bring the standard to market. Then we'll highlight some key innovations that will be useful to a broad range of stakeholders. And then I'll pass it along to my colleague Owen Hewlett, our Chief Technical Officer, who will go into the details about what's important for project developers to know as they transition to Gold Standard for the Global Goals and introduce new projects under the standard. And then we'll take a look forward and let you know what's coming next. So why Gold Standard for the Global Goals? Why have we embarked on this journey? The first, perhaps obviously, is the new climate regime, the Paris Climate Agreement. And here we see that there's a really big gap between the ambition of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and the nationally determined contributions. In order to close that gap, we know that markets will have to play a role. But the rule book is still being defined, but we already know that the bottom-up nature of the NDCs stands to put at least some gold standard projects at risk for double counting, which would then threaten their ability to issue and sell credits. But at the same time, new provisions, such as the non-market mechanisms under Article 6.8, can open up new opportunities to continue driving finance to gold standard projects. And then there's the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a tremendous opportunity because this is what people really care about. Having enough income, the ability to put food on the table, access to clean water, to energy, to healthcare, opportunities for education and employment. And so it's clear that one metric is not enough. Measuring carbon alone won't motivate enough people to solve the climate crisis. And so positioning outcomes like new job creation, gender equality, saving lives as co-benefits are underselling these transformative impacts. And therefore, where carbon used to be the primary outcome that Gold Standard certifies, we know that now we need to broaden that field and attract a larger range of funders into Gold Standard projects. And once you do this, you quickly realize that many targets and indicators are interconnected. In some cases, this is great news. By leveraging cross-cutting benefits like gender equality, for example, you empower an entire half of the population. But then on the other side, increasing food production requires water and energy and could lead to land use change that cuts down forest. Decreasing poverty and economic growth can lead to increased GHG emissions if not managed properly. So it's clear that we need to maximize our positive impacts and at the same time mitigate risks and very carefully and deliberately manage trade-offs to feed back into that maximizing those positive impacts. But to reach these 17 goals and 169 targets has an obvious cost, but at the same time, there's a greater cost of not meeting them. And there's real value, in particular to the private sector, and opportunity to realize these goals. But the question is, how do we convince people? How do we move the private sector to direct their capital to meeting the SDGs? And to do that, we need to demonstrate real value. So Gold Standard for the Global Goals is intended to demonstrate quantified and certified impacts and to clearly show the value that that creates. And so who has been involved in the development and now the deployment of? We've been working with a broad range of strategic partners, some that we've been working with for many years and others newer to the Gold Standard community, to ensure that the new tools that we develop are not just technically sound, but also find their way in the market. So what is Gold Standard for the Global Goals really? In its simplest articulation, Gold Standard for the Global Goals is a next generation standard to quantify, certify, and most importantly, maximize impacts towards both climate security and sustainable development. How does this fit into the broader gold standard strategy? First and foremost, Gold Standard for the Global Goals will help ensure that gold standard projects remain relevant, resilient, and can differentiate themselves well into the future in changing policy environments and in changing markets. Secondly, we're working to build demand for carbon credits while also bringing in new funders to SDG impacts that your projects deliver. And last but not least, we're working to reduce the complexity and the costs of certification so that we can scale our efforts and make your lives easier. The first and perhaps the most important innovation that Gold Standard for the Global Goals offers is the ability to future-proof your projects. By having the flexibility to choose between carbon credits and new certification options like certified emission reduction statements can help project developers mitigate the risk of double counting in the geographies where that can occur. A second and equally important innovation is in strengthening our core differentiator around sustainable development. Owen will walk through the technical details of this, but this happens at the process level in our environmental and social safeguards and our local stakeholder engagement process, as well as the performance level in being able to quantify SDG impacts and connecting that with the targets and indicators that are outlined in that agenda. Gold Standard for the Global Goals will now be relevant in an even broader range of applications. We'll continue to focus on our historic role of ensuring the highest levels of quality in environmental markets, but you'll see how this broadens through results-based finance for development, different applications of corporate reporting, and the ability to scale to larger interventions in climate and development. Just as we're working to ensure that gold standard projects are relevant in a changing policy context, we're also working to open doors that were once closed to offsetting. We're doing this by defining the funding of carbon credits as a mechanism to deliver climate finance. And we're working with an ecosystem of influential partners to place climate finance as a core pillar of a corporate climate strategy. And the tie-in with Gold Standard for the Global Goals is that best practice corporate climate action is now being defined as setting reduction targets in line with science, i.e. setting a science-based target. Secondly, to invest in emission reductions within, but also beyond your core business by, for instance, purchasing carbon credits. And then ensuring those efforts contribute to the global goals. So choosing projects like Gold Standard that also deliver development benefits beyond the carbon mitigation. And what's really exciting is that those contributions to the global goals can now be monetized. Under the new standard, project developers can choose to issue a number of different impacts to monetize and drive finance to their projects. Developers now also have the flexibility to certify at the project level and not to issue carbon credits or any other monetizable impacts. So large-scale or multi-intervention initiatives can follow safeguards and stakeholder requirements in order to de-risk investments and enable quantification and reporting of impact. And last but certainly not least, we're working to introduce new innovations that shift the complexity from the project developer to the standard. This includes new digitized standard documentation that should allow you to easily navigate the standard documents that you need when you need them, as well as new tools such as the Cookstove IQ that will allow for easier baseline setting and monitoring in the field to lower certification complexity and costs. Our partnership with the UNFCCC Secretariat is intended not only to raise the profile of Gold Standard and our projects, but also to accelerate the development of new streamlined methodologies and new tools that will help assess and report on impact that Gold Standard projects deliver in the field. And all of this will culminate with a cutting-edge IT infrastructure called Gold Standard IQ, or Gold Standard Impact Quantification, that will be a one-stop shop to make it easy and intuitive to design a project, to apply methodologies, to conduct the monitoring in the field, and to report in an easy and automated way that also demonstrates and visualizes the value created from your projects. I'll end here with this look forward and pass it over to Owen Hewlett, who will outline exactly what you can expect from the standard and what it means for your project.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening this far. I'm Owen Hewlett and I'm Chief Technical Officer at Gold Standard, here to take you through some of the new features of Gold Standard for the global goals as compared to previous versions. The first thing to say is that the standard has been taken apart and put back together again in a modular structure. What this means in practice is that we've taken time to categorize the various elements of the standard and separate these out into new documents and a more logical flow. So, instead of one document that has everything from the safeguards to emission reduction calculations, we now break these out into separate modules. The first thing that allows us to do is to be more flexible on the certification pathways project developers take. For example, the two green boxes on the left in this slide are required to be applied by all projects regardless of type and pathway, and really drive the greater consistency of certification and what Gold Standard stands for. The boxes on the right in blue are more flexible and optional, giving a wider variety of certification pathways to project developers, and later on in this presentation I'll give some examples. But the first big change that this allows us to take is that the project can be Gold Standard certified, the two boxes on the left, but isn't required automatically to issue carbon credits or any other products that it would do so if it follows the boxes on the right. So, for the first time, we allow project-only certification under Gold Standard. The core principles and spirit of Gold Standard have been retained in those mandatory requirements. While these have been updated to latest best practice, there is much you will recognise, and the changes I'll come on to shortly. The principles and requirements are organised around 5 core principles. Climate in the Sustainable Development Goals talks about how to define a baseline in a project scenario. It talks about some of the general eligibility criteria, and it defines how to demonstrate Sustainable Development Goal contributions. All projects will have to demonstrate 3 SDG impacts. One of those must be SDG 13 as related to climate mitigation or adaptation. While 3 sounds like more than we've had in previous versions, in fact, if you stop and think about it, it's actually the same. In version 2.2, we required demonstration of a commitment of impact to climate mitigation, i.e. the issuance of carbon credits, plus 2 positive impacts on the Millennium Development Goals. So overall, with some refinement and some improved clarity of requirements, projects will actually demonstrate similarly to before. Principle 2, safeguards, is around an update and an evolution to our do no harm approach. The safeguards bring together all of the safeguards from energy and land use and water and bring a consistency to what Gold Standard safeguards stand for. The list of safeguards does look long, confess, but in fact, if you dig into those details, you'll find much greater clarity than was there under the do no harm requirements in previous versions. And you'll also find that many of the requirements won't apply or can be overlooked by certain project types. So, for example, it's unlikely a wind farm will need to consider the rules on animal husbandry, and it's unlikely that a cook stove project will have issues with genetically modified organisms. Principle 3, stakeholder inclusivity, a key tenet of what Gold Standard has stood for many years, is retained. Projects will still be required to undergo stakeholder consultation and ongoing feedback, and record issuances and grievances and deal with those accordingly. The only slight tweak to the stakeholder consultation is that it shifts from a message of local stakeholder consultation to effective stakeholder consultation. That because certain stakeholders may not be local to the project, particularly in larger urban projects or those that affect a broader area of the watershed, for example. So projects just need to give a little more thought to whether their project affects stakeholders outside the project boundary. Principle 4 is around demonstration of real impacts, and this really is where the certification cycle comes in, and I'll explain the new certification cycle in a forthcoming slide. And finally, Principle 5 concerns additionality and ongoing financial need. Additionality is required to be demonstrated for projects that are seeking results-based finance products such as carbon credits, but isn't necessarily applicable to all projects seeking Gold Standard only, project-only certification. Ongoing financial need is a new concept introduced to the standard that requires projects to demonstrate at certification renewal that they still require gold standard finance to survive. What we found with the very lengthy CDM crediting periods is that, in fact, as you go through those, some industries have transformed and no longer require finance at year 15, 16, 17, 18, for example. And so really the effect that has is to divert that pot of finance away from projects that are genuinely in need of it. On the optional side, projects will have more choice over the methodologies they use and the products they issue. The classic use of GS remains valid. We are porting across all of our emission reduction methodologies and carbon credit requirements, but you may be aware that other innovative approaches such as A-dailies in health and labelling of renewable energy certificates are coming forward. This really allows the project developer to choose their pathway with much greater flexibility. And as I alluded to, really, by breaking up the standard into modules, we allow that greater choice of project pathway for developers. Working left to right, you'll see in the yellow boxes the mandatory requirements for certain project types, and in the blue boxes, some of the optional methodologies and product requirements they can issue. So, for example, imagine a cook stove project there, the top pathway. It would apply the gold standard for the global goals, principles and requirements that I just talked about. It would apply the community service activity requirements that provides specific activity derogations, deviations and new rules compared to the principles and requirements as applicable to cook stoves. And then it would apply the relevant emission reduction methodologies or the A-dailies methodologies and be able to issue emission reduction carbon credits or A-dailies statements accordingly. The same would go for renewable energy, where the new option of renewable energy label requirements is applied. There's no methodology associated with that, since RECs are issued one-to-one with megawatt hours passed to the grid. And in land use, of course, we have the AR and agriculture emission requirements documents, and the emissions reductions could be issued as carbon credits. Some of the key changes I just wanted to reiterate following my previous slide. Under climate and SDG impact, as I mentioned, all projects must contribute to SDG 13 plus 2 further SDGs. Principle 2, safeguarding principles. All projects now conduct a safeguarding principles assessment, which requires them to consider a series of mandatory requirements and assessment questions to decide if a requirement is relevant to that project type. If it is relevant, then we expect to see a demonstration of mitigation and for that to be monitored. If it's not relevant, then it would be monitored only in the case that that situation changes. I would stress that although the safeguarding principles do look quite lengthy compared to previous do no harm, you'll find there's a lot more clarity in there on how to apply them. And of course, when you take out the ones that aren't relevant to a specific project type, the list isn't so onerous at all. In fact, when we compared the number that we felt would typically be relevant to a cook stove project, for example, they were the same number of relevant sections that would have been applicable under the previous do no harm assessments in version 2.2. Principle 3, really, as I mentioned, is about considering affected stakeholders outside the project area, and it also has more stringent consideration of gender-related issues, so making sure to take into account the issues faced by women in participating in projects, and also by men. Principle 4, I'll come on to on the next slide, is really the new project pathway. And Principle 5, we continue to make use of the CDM tools to demonstrate financial additionality, but we introduce a new concept of ongoing financial need, where in a project, at certification renewal, will demonstrate to gold standard that it still needs that finance. That's not to say that the project becomes unadditional. We shouldn't confuse the two concepts. Once you're additional, you will always be additional because that's the decision that you took. It just means that in the case where an industry begins to change or a project is highly successful, it's no longer claiming carbon credits, for example, that is diverting cash away from projects that actually still do require it. I'll come on to this later, but we're actually going to be going to public consultation on the new additionality and ongoing financial need requirements. We very much look forward to hearing feedback on those principles. And now on to the certification cycle. The certification cycle will be familiar to users of existing gold standard with some subtle changes of terminology and timescales. We still require an ex-ante process whereby the project is designed, consulted upon, validated and reviewed by gold standard, ultimately resulting in project design certification. So project design certification as a term replaces the term registration in gold standard for the global goals. That's important. We wanted to recognise that while registration is a commonly accepted term, it's not necessarily intuitive to new users of gold standard, and it doesn't reflect that in fact a certification decision should be taken there. The design is certified. So I'll just focus briefly on ex-ante processes, working left to right. As normal, a project would come to life. Really, the project developer would come up with a project idea and begin to develop it. It would reach out to stakeholders and conduct a stakeholder consultation before submitting to preliminary review to gold standard. Preliminary review replaces pre-feasibility assessment in both energy and land use and has two pathways: a simple desk check or a more detailed review of documentation. It actually follows very similarly the process to pre-feasibility assessment that you'll be familiar with from previous versions. And I would expect that projects that undergo a fairly simple check through to listing would continue to do so here. But preliminary review really brings together those two pathways under land use and energy, and makes a common language for that. So once preliminary review is completed, gold standard will list the project, assuming that's been successful. The project can then proceed to validation. It will appoint a GS validation or verification body, and there the same eligibility applies to previous versions. So if the type of auditor you were using before, you'll be able to use under gold standard for the global goals, although there will now be an application process for GS VVBs to remain eligible for gold standard. In the very short term, before 1st of November 2017, if you've signed up for a validation, that will still apply. Post 1st of November 2017, gold standard will publish the list of eligible auditors so that you can select. So validation proceeds as it always has done, with a site visit and an assessment by the VVB. That is submitted to gold standard, who conduct a design review of 4 weeks, and if that's successful, then that ultimately ends with project design certification. The sharp-eyed amongst you will notice that the previous registration review timeline of 6 weeks has been reduced to 4 weeks. It's an efficiency we've been able to provide in reviewing our processes, hopefully of benefit to some users. So once a project is certified for its design, it can move to ex post, and as always, we'll conduct monitoring in accordance with the principles and requirements, activity requirements, and any methodologies that are being applied. In this case, imagine a project that monitors for 2 years in this first monitoring period. At the end of that period, it submits for verification by a GS VVP, and it notifies gold standard that that's going ahead. The verification will occur as it always has done, with a site visit and an assessment by the VVB, who provide a report, and gold standard then conduct a performance review of 3 weeks. Assuming that's been successful, then the project is issued with whichever statements and products it was seeking. So very similar to previous ex post project cycle. Now, there are a few changes. Ex post, in a year that you don't verify, you are required to publish an annual report. It's a very simple document. It's not certified or reviewed by gold standard. It really just tells us that you still exist, and it provides some information to stakeholders. It's not an onerous requirement. I appreciate some people were concerned that an annual report was an additional burden on project developers, but envisage a document that's between 1 and 3 pages long, and is really only a summary of activity and any comments that you've received and any key changes that are going on. So really not a very onerous thing. We're finding that we don't get regular feedback from project developers, so it's quite difficult for us to know if a project is still proceeding, and the annual report is a really great tool to help us stay in touch with projects. Note that the annual report does not need to be required on years when a verification takes place. So if you're annually verifying at the moment, then you won't have to submit any annual reports at all. The other big change really is that the certification cycle is shortened to a default 5 years. So instead of a fixed 10-year or 3 times 7-year renewable period in energy, it will now revert to a 5-year cycle. At the end of 5 years, you're required to renew your certification in the same way that you always have done. Now, specific activity types will need to do less than stated in the principal requirements, which states that the baseline must be updated and ongoing financial need need to be proven, and any changes to the project need to be checked. For example, in forestry projects, we aren't going to ask for the baseline to be updated, and we aren't going to be asking for ongoing financial need demonstration. That's a specific project type that doesn't require that check. So, as a default, that check is required, but specific activity types have certain derogations which reflect the nature of the project. All projects have a maximum duration of 10 years, so that's one renewal. There are no 3 times 7s anymore, and there's no fixed 10. So as a default, all projects are one renewal up to 10 years maximum. However, cookstove projects, for example, will have a 15-year maximum, so 2 renewals, and land use projects will have the same duration that they've always done. So I would check the individual activity requirements. If there's nothing stated, then 10 years is the maximum. And this really reflects latest best practice. 5 years aligns with the Paris reporting cycle, the Paris Agreement reporting cycle, and 10 years as a cap it reflects really the kind of latest best practice thinking around additionality and financial need. So really just a summary of the key changes in the certification cycle. The preliminary review replaces PFA, although very similar in process. Listing still takes place, validation still takes place. Design review replaces registration review and is now 4 weeks instead of 6. And design certification replaces registration, just reflecting clearer language and really formally recording that that is a certification step. Ex post verification still takes place, performance review still takes place, and issuance still takes place. The key changes, as I said, really are the change to 5-year renewals, the requirement to publish an annual report, and the need to update baseline and ongoing financial need at certification renewal. There are some key exceptions I just mentioned. Renewable energy projects, we will allow you now to issue GSVERs and gold standard labeled renewable energy certificates, but not for the same megawatt hour. And obviously we'll be checking that very carefully. That's one key exception. Certification renewal is mandatory at every 5 years, but community service projects will not require to check the baseline at the first renewal. There's new definitions of scale for microscale for renewable energy and community-focused activity projects, particularly where those projects aren't seeking carbon credits, so emission reduction scale definitions don't really make sense anymore. And there's some new deemed additionality criteria for community service projects, which are worth checking out. So that's really a summary of the changes in gold standard for the global goals. I'll just take a brief moment to explain what's coming up next, some of the milestones that you can expect to see. The gold standard for the global goals requirements come into effect on the 14th of August. That means new projects on or after the 14th of August should apply gold standard for the global goals requirements. We are looking to transition all projects to gold standard for the global goals. This is an important point to make. All projects will transfer to gold standard for the global goals. That will happen at the first available verification that occurs after the 1st of March 2018. Before the 1st of March 2018, if you're verifying, you do not need to transition to gold standard for the global goals. The transition will take place directly between the project developer and the gold standard. There's no need to involve your auditor in that process, and we're looking to design a process that is very smooth and simple. You'll simply have to fill out a checklist and provide some evidence, and we will decide upon that transition within gold standard itself. Really trying to limit the amount of things that project developers need to do to demonstrate conformity to GS for GG. And in most cases, we expect it to be a fairly simple process. There's also a grace period associated with gold standard for the global goals. If you've submitted to gold standard anytime up to the 1st of November 2017, you can continue to register under the previous version. So, for example, if you're undergoing validation right now, you can continue to register under version 2.2 and you'll transition to gold standard for the global goals at your first verification after the 1st of March 2018. So there is a grace period to give people a little bit of time to adjust. I would also say, just to avoid any confusion, you don't need to transition on the 1st of March 2018. It's the first verification that comes forward on or after the 1st of March. So in some cases, land use projects, for example, that verification might not take place for 3 years. So we might not see you transitioning until 2019. You can choose to transition earlier, however, that's totally acceptable. Some other milestones that you might like to be aware of. Our gender responsive framework will be released in October 2018. Gold standard for the global goals already includes some enhancements towards gender sensitivity in its safeguards and in its stakeholder, but we'll also be exploring positive gender benefits in our gender responsive framework that we'll release in October. Projects looking to claim positive impact on SDG 5. We're going to conduct a consultation on additionality and ongoing financial need, so that project developers have an opportunity particularly to feed in on those innovations, and how we change that going forward in light of recent documentation and research papers published. So everybody will have the chance to feed in on that. At the moment, our additionality requirement is based on the CDM. We are going to be doing more work on post-2020 voluntary carbon markets. I know many project developers are concerned about that. We are also very mindful of what's coming forward there, so do look out for further notification and updates on the nature of voluntary markets post-2020. Extremely excited about our application to join the ICEAL Alliance, which for those that don't know is really a membership standard for standards. Its members include Fairtrade, FSC, UTS, Rainforest Alliance, MSC, so a really strong group of standards bodies that Gold Standard feels it should be part of. It really requires us to think carefully about how we set standards, how we certify against that standard, and how we deal with governance and oversight. Gold Standard does a lot of those things very well at the moment, but we're very much looking forward to improving and coming into line with the ICEAL codes. Any questions on that, please do reach out. And obviously, Gold Standard for the Global Goals really sets the platform for future development of SDG tools and methodologies, and developers can bring those forward to us as well. So if you're interested in a new area of the SDGs or any other innovation, please do reach out to us. You can reach out to me at owen.hewlett@goldstandard.org. My address is on the website, or help@goldstandard.org will also reach us. So just to lay out those upcoming milestones in a flow here, 10th of July, you will have seen that the standard published on the Gold Standard website. 14th of August is when it comes into effect for new projects, but anything that is submitted to Gold Standard up until the 1st of November 2017 can continue to register under whichever version of the standard it has currently been applying. You can also choose to switch to GS for GG, but you don't have to up until 1st of November 2017. The next relevant date really is the 1st of March 2018. As I said, all projects will transition to Gold Standard for the Global Goals at the first verification or renewal that takes place on or after the 1st of March 2018, except those projects that have less than 24 months to run on their crediting cycle. Those projects can transition to Gold Standard for the Global Goals, but they don't have to. Upon transition, the balance of the existing crediting period is retained. So if your next verification is year 3 of your first 7 years, you'll have the remaining 4 years of that crediting period to go, and then you'll switch to the 5-year cycle and the maximum period after that. And as I say, we'll develop a really simple transition check to help you through the process. And really with that, I'd like to thank you so much for getting to the end of what is quite a long but hopefully informative presentation. We're very excited about Gold Standard for the Global Goals. We hope you are too, and we look forward to demonstrating some of the new innovations that work within that platform in the coming months and years. Please do get in touch. As I say, I'm owen.hewlett@goldstandard.org, or help@goldstandard.org will also work. And I very much look forward to working with you all. Thank you very much.